Gracias. En 2006, el Consejo Europeo publicó una declaración que ponía en iguales términos, esto es, igualaba el fascismo y el comunismo, declarando a ambos responsables de los mayores crímenes contra la humanidad. Algunos años después, en 2019, con ocasión del 80 aniversario del inicio de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, otra resolución de la Unión Europea culpó de esta guerra a Alemania y a la Unión Soviética, en particular al pacto o acuerdo Hitler-Stalin. Para quienes conocen la historia de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, esta resolución era una absoluta tergiversación, otro mito estilo Hollywood. Mi pregunta es, ¿cuál es la mejor manera de demoler este mito y por qué? Perdón por las dos preguntas en una. ¿Por qué la Unión Europea está tan empeñada en renovar el ataque al comunismo a más de 20 años del final de la Guerra Fría?
Well, I'd like to begin by answering the second part of your question. Why is the European Union still involved in that? Well, the answer is not too difficult. Before the Second World War started, the elites that hated, despised the country of the revolution, the Soviet Union, and were really looking forward to seeing Hitler destroy it, and therefore had nothing against fascism. They were to be found not only in the United States, they certainly had them, and they were the ones who would, of course, be the winner country, the country that would come out as the leader of the imperialist camp. But there were a lot of people like that in France, in Belgium, in Holland, in Britain. There was a lot of people who loved fascism, even in the royal family. A lot of members of the aristocracy, even the royal family in Britain, loved Mussolini, and Churchill loved Mussolini. They loved Franco. They liked Hitler. I mean, they didn't agree with the style of Hitler. They thought he exaggerated a bit. You know what I mean? They had some criticisms, but really they liked what he was going to do, especially if he would have been able to destroy the Soviet Union, he would have become a saint. So in Europe, there was a class, you could call it the upper class, and don't forget, that's the bourgeoisie, but also still the old aristocracy, including the crown heads of Europe, the royal families of Britain and so on, who are now, of course, heavily involved in business and capitalist ventures anyways, So they were there. They were the ones who supported Hitler's policy silently because they could not say out loud what they were hoping for, namely the destruction of the land of the revolution, and therefore a land that actually was capable or was on the side of democracy. But that's a different issue we can talk about again some other time or later on. So when the war ended, there were a lot of these people who were afraid that they would have to pay the price now for their support for Nazism, active or passive. Because in every country, there were collaborators with Nazi Germany. Certainly in France, like there was the Vichy government, and in Germany, there was the most German industrialists and bankers and university professors, basically who supported Hitler. But there was also the working class in most countries that hated Hitler because they had sympathized with the Soviet Union, and they were the leaders of the resistance. And I'm thinking about France, for example. They were the leaders of the resistance, right? So they were hoping for big changes. They didn't want to just simply put the clock back to 1939 and say, okay, let's start all over again. No, they were hoping that the victory of the Soviet Union, would actually allow them to bring in certain reforms that would be similar. In other words, bring in social reforms, more democracy, right? And again, as after the First World War, since there was a big push, for more reforms, democratic reforms, that's why they were brought in countries like England, France. The welfare state was brought in to diffuse potentially a revolutionary situation, to prevent revolution. And that actually improved the life of a lot of people, working class people in France and Belgium, Benelux countries, in Britain and everywhere, right? And basically made them turn away from the idea of revolution. But what I'm saying is the fear of revolution, and the hatred of the Soviet Union. Now even greater, because when the Soviet Union had got going, there was always a hope that the experiment of the Soviet Union would simply collapse, that it just wouldn't work. Now that didn't work. And then there was the hope that it would collapse when Hitler would come marching in, and that didn't work. So the fact that the Soviet Union survived and triumphed, that a socialist country could actually beat the most powerful capitalist country, that was a scary thought. And that, by the way, that encouraged a lot of colonies of the West to demand their independence afterwards. Without the success of the Soviet Union, countries like India and Vietnam would not have been able to become independent, right? So what I'm saying is the elites in Europe, when the war ended, still nourished the old hatreds of the Soviet Union, the fear of more democracy, even though they had to bring in more democracy. And this is where the European Union now comes in. Because now in Western Europe, the United States is taken over, right? And for example, in many countries, the United States occupied the countries and are still there. I mean, today, the United States still occupies Germany. Germany is not a free country. Germany is not liberated by the Americans. The Americans occupied Germany. And Charles de Gaulle himself said clearly on a number of occasions that the Americans, when they came into France, did not come in as liberators. They came in as the second wave of occupiers. They simply replaced the Germans as occupiers, and they forced their policies on the new governments that emerged in countries like France, Britain, and so on. And that meant also that they chose to collaborate not with the representatives of the resistance movements, which tended to be left-wingers, communists, socialists, and you name it, but they tend to collaborate with the former collaborators who had been philo-fascists, as I call it, friends of fascism, if not fascists themselves, right? That also, by the way, shows that there's also the reason why, when the war ended, why the Americans did nothing to get rid of Franco in Spain. The Americans and British could easily have sent a message to Madrid and told Franco to step down and get out of the country we're coming, but they never did anything because they liked Franco. They thought Franco was a good guy. They had nothing against Franco, just as they had nothing against Hitler or Mussolini. They loved fascism. And these leaders then, these former collaborators of Nazi Germany, who at one point had hoped that Nazi Germany would do the dirty work against the revolution against the Soviet Union, now we're hoping the Americans would do it. And it's fair to say that the Americans arranged for people like that to come to power all over Europe. And it's fair to say that actually they also were behind setting up the European Union. The European Union in many ways was the creation of people who had collaborated with the Germans in France during the war and who are now collaborating with the Americans after the war. And that means that they were reporting for duty in that job that was still to be done as far as the Americans were concerned after the war, namely that war against revolution, against the land of revolution. We got to eliminate the Soviet Union. And that's why they reported for duty. And then 1989, 1990, when the wall came down in Europe, in Eastern Europe, in Poland, in Estonia, and Latvia, and all these countries, the Americans brought to power the most reactionary, the most conservative, the most pro-capitalist elements they could possibly think of. And these are the people that they put into power. And they're the ones, of course, that for two reasons. First, because they've always hated the Soviet Union, we're happy to put the blame on the Soviet Union. And also because it covered up their own collaboration with the Nazis. Because in some cases, the collaboration of, for example, the Polish government in the 1930s with Nazi Germany is something that they don't want us to know about, right? And that's why they keep on pointing the finger to the Soviets, because so that we don't consider what they did. But it's a fact, and I've written an article, quite a long article, about the Ribbentrop Pact that the Polish government, for example, which was not a democracy at all. People think Poland was a democracy. It was not. In 1937, 38, 39, collaborated very warmly with Hitler because they were both anti-Soviet and they were both had their eyes on lands in the Ukraine and so on, right? And in 1990, when the Soviet Union collapsed, in some ways the anti-Russian, ex-Soviet feelings were still there, because we should not forget that one of the motives for the Germans to want for German capitalism, you might say, for German imperialism, to like Hitler and to want him to organize a war against the Soviet Union was not only that they expected from that the advantage of the destruction of communism in its own cradle, but also access to all these wonderful lands full of resources, like the rich agricultural land of Ukraine and the oil fields of the Caucasus, and you name it, right? And that's still there today. So to jump ahead now, the war in Ukraine today is very much also about these resources. We know that, for example, the Zelensky regime right now has already arranged to sell much of its agricultural land to big American corporations, like Monsanto and so on, and German corporations. And that's why the Germans are there again, because it's the same old story. Germany looking for what they call in German an Ergänzungsgebiet, a complementary land that will complement the industrial heartland of Germany itself, because they need more agricultural resources. And they need, of course, the big problem that Germany had in the First and Second World War was the lack of resources, especially oil and rubber, petroleum and rubber. It's mainly because of the lack of petroleum and rubber that Germany lost the war in 1918, and that Germany would lose the Second World War, because they didn't have the resources. At the end of the war, the Second World War, Germany had the best tanks and jet fighter planes, but they couldn't use them. They sat on the ground because they had no oil. They had no petroleum. Had they defeated the Soviet Union in 1941, they would have had all the oil, the petroleum they wanted, and we, the British, the Americans, could never have landed in Normandy and defeated Nazi Germany. So I think I've answered the question as to why the European Union keeps coming up on this and keeps pretending that they think that the Soviet Union was responsible, because they have something to hide, their skeletons in their closets.
¿Y qué puedes decirnos sobre el papel del pacto Hitler-Stalin, del que tanto hemos oído hablar?
Well, I've written a longish article about the Hitler-Stalin Pact. The Hitler-Stalin Pact was, first of all, there was many countries that signed a pact, a treaty with Hitler Germany. In fact, the first country to do that is the country we call now Vatican City. Hitler came to power in January 1933. And in that same year, the Vatican made a pact with Hitler because it was to their advantage. And the second country to make a pact with Hitler was Poland in 1934. And that pact was very much directed against the Soviet Union. And then this other country that made a pact with Germany immediately was Britain. It was a naval agreement. So pacts with Nazi Germany seemingly were not a problem as long as we did it. But when Stalin did it, it was certainly a big deal. But we can also ask why Stalin did it. Well, Stalin did it at the very, very end, after everybody else had tried to make pacts with Hitler and had made pacts with Hitler. Stalin actually, for the longest time, was looking to make a pact with London and with Paris against Hitler, not a pact with Hitler against London and Paris, because it's wrong to think that Stalin was wanting to conquer Europe in collaboration with Hitler. These are fantasies. There's no truth to this whatsoever. So Stalin knew very well, all the Soviets knew that Hitler had plans to destroy the Soviet Union. They had read Mein Kampf. They knew what it was all about, had no illusions. What they wanted was actually interest the rest of Europe, especially the big powers, Britain and France, in a defense pact, defense arrangement against Hitler. And they approached London, they approached Paris. You can read the diaries of the Russian ambassador, Litvinov and Maisky in London at the time. They tried so hard, but they were turned down. They were turned down because the powers, the leaders in Britain and in Paris were the people that I just described, that wanted Hitler to march against the Soviet Union. So they weren't interested in a pact with the Soviet Union against Hitler. But of course they couldn't say that, right? But they kept finding excuses. So they kept frustrating Stalin's efforts to construct an alliance against Hitler. And instead they were obviously maneuvering to have Hitler march against the Soviet Union. Well, by the summer of 1939, after years of trying, Stalin basically gave up. And he could make an arrangement with Hitler that actually was very advantageous because of complications which I won't explain here right now, but you can find it in my article. But the pact that Hitler was willing to conclude with Stalin, and that Stalin was willing to conclude with Hitler, actually was, without that pact, Germany would have won the war. And without that pact, the Soviet Union would have lost the war. And I'll tell you in two simple reasons. Well, first of all, the pact allowed Stalin some time to prepare defenses against a German attack, which they knew was going to come sooner or later. All right, so they gained time. All right, and that was very important because it would actually, rather than attacking the Soviet Union already in 1939, as we now know Hitler had planned to do, right? Hitler would only attack the Soviet Union in the summer, in June 1941. That's a full 2 years later, right? And that during those 2 years, the Soviet Union did an awful lot to improve their defenses. They still weren't perfect, that's for sure, because they still suffer heavy blows when the Nazis would be coming in. But it would have been much worse had the Germans attacked in 1939. But more important than that, the pact also gave the Soviet Union some space, some strategic space, because the pact was an agreement whereby Germany acknowledged the Soviet Union's right to what the historians still call Eastern Poland. Well, the news about Eastern Poland is that it wasn't Eastern Poland, that it was former Russian territory to which actually the Soviet Union was entitled, but which had been conquered in a war which is never mentioned in this Polish-Russian War of 1921-22, when Pilsudski attacked Russia during the Civil War and took advantage of it to grab some territories in what is now the Ukraine and Belarus, and annexed them and called them Eastern Poland. Well, part of the pact concluded, the Ribbentrop Pact, was for Germany to recognize that those territories should go back to the Soviet Union, which was the heir to the former Russian Empire, right? And that is what happened. The pact allowed the Red Army to come in and occupy that territory, right? Okay, and that meant that the border moved up about 200-300 kilometers further west. All right, that meant that when the Germans would attack in 1941, their starting point for the march to Moscow and Leningrad and all that was 300 kilometers further away from the objective. Right? Now we know that in November 1941, that the Germans were within 20 kilometers of Moscow. All right. Now imagine they would have started 300 kilometers closer to Moscow. They would definitely have taken Moscow, wouldn't they? I mean, there's every reason to believe they would. And that might or might not, we don't know. We cannot know what might have happened. But obviously, having those 300 kilometers, your border, 300 kilometers further west, was an amazing advantage that very likely allowed the Soviet Union to survive the attack of Nazi Germany when it came in June of 1941. And there's some other aspects I could talk about, but these are the most important ones. Without that advantage that was gained from the pact, it is almost 100% certain that Hitler Germany would have defeated the Soviet Union in 1941, and therefore would have had the agricultural lands of the Ukraine, and more importantly, the petroleum fields of the Caucasus. And that meant that in 1944, for example, those German jets and Tiger tanks would not have been captured by the Allied troops sitting there running out of gas. They would have had plenty of gas, and we, the British, the Americans, the Canadians, would never have been able to defeat the Germans. So it's thanks to the Ribbentrop Pact that we, the good guys, won the Second World War.
Es sabido que la Segunda Guerra Mundial permitió a los Estados Unidos no solamente superar la Gran Depresión de los años 1930, sino también salir siendo el país más poderoso de la Tierra. Ahora, nos preguntamos si la actual implicación por poderes de los Estados Unidos y de la OTAN en la guerra de Ucrania podría ser también un modo de aliviar la crisis económica que afecta a la tierra del tío Sam. ¿O hay otros motivos? ¿Cuál es su opinión al respecto?
Well, again, wars are complicated, complex historical developments, and there's always more than one side to it. But let's focus on the economic side of it. I wrote an article about 20 somewhat years ago when the United States moved into Iraq, and I wrote it, Why America Needs War. And I repeat that. Why does America need war? Need war, really can live without war. It is because the American economy was in the dumps in the 1930s and was in really bad shape. The Great Depression was the American economy was collapsing, and it was saved only by the war, because the war basically stimulated demand. And before that, the main reason for the depression was that there wasn't enough demand, because American industry had become so productive thanks to the new techniques invented by the guys like Henry Ford, the production belt and all that. They produced so many cars, but people were poor, people couldn't buy them. So if you produce too much, you got to stop producing. You got to lay off people. Then people get even poorer, can't even buy fewer. So there was basically the vicious circle whereby the economy came to a standstill because there was overproduction and there was not enough demand in face of the huge supply. Right now, the war solved that problem, because the war suddenly a big supply. Right, so basically the orders came rolling in, not only from the American government that now wanted more weapons, but through Lend-Lease, the British were buying weapons and paying for them, because people think the Marshall Plan and all that was the Americans giving things away. It's not true at all. Paying for it, okay, high prices. Later on, the Lend-Lease system of loans, to the Allies. That's how the Americans American business started to do well again. In fact, it's fair to say that the aggregate demand generated by the war is what solved the problem of the American economic crisis of the 30s. And that also meant that when in 1945 it looked like that wonderful war was going to be over, economists in the United States started to ring alarm bells and said, we are going to have a big problem, because when the war stops, the demand for weapons will stop and the economy will deflate, will collapse. And millions of soldiers will come home, look for a job when there's no more jobs, when there's no more production. It's going to be a huge crisis. We're going to slip back into the 60s. It's in the 30s. The 30s, the 1930s, were in the United States known as the dirty 30s, meaning economic bad times, but also as the red 30s. The red 30s, because of the bad times, socialists, communists, anarchists were very successful, were very influential, right? So the fear was that in 1945, when the war would end, that, oh my God, not only will the economy start to slide back in the depression, the dirty 30s will be back, but the red 30s will be back, because people will have jobs, will get nasty, will get mad, there'll be strikes, there'll be problems, there could be even a revolution. We had to prevent that. How can we prevent it? Well, we can prevent it by keep on going. We can prevent it by keeping the war economy at a war footing, meaning if the war is good for business, our business needs a war. So essentially, it's like in the old days, the king is dead, long live the king. In 1945, the Americans said the war is over, long live the next war. And that's where the Cold War came in perfectly to take over, right? And then a big problem of the American economy was in 1990, when the Soviet Union, that wonderful enemy that had justified enormous investments in weapons to keep the economy going, suddenly disappeared. And then there was a big scramble in the United States to look for another enemy. And they looked at Saddam Hussein and Milosevic and all these guys, until, of course, they found a wonderful new enemy, and the international terrorism. That was in 2001, this engineered attack in New York. And that allows the American economy to continue on a war footing. And that, of course, is a way you can understand the war in Ukraine now. That war in Ukraine really is a war of the form of economic warfare. I mean, the killing and dying is done by the Russians and the Ukrainians. But the money is made, the war is made in the United States. Because the Americans are sending weapons, sending tanks. Everybody's sending tanks. Everybody's sending tanks and weapons. It costs money. I mean, the companies that produce these weapons are all based in the United States. And they don't give those things away for nothing. No, the Americans pay for it. And so the war is actually good for the economy. And now, because of that war, it allowed the Americans to scare the Swedes and the Finns into joining NATO. Now, that's wonderful for business as well, because joining NATO means that you have to buy uniforms and weapons that mostly from American sources, right? So the more members of NATO, the more business for America. NATO is a kind of the marketing and sales office of the military industrial complex of the United States, right? In fact, the biggest companies in the United States are the ones that are making their plenty of money out of wars, real hot wars or threatening wars, right? And warlike organizations like NATO. That's where the money is to be made. And if, like I say, if wars would end, if peace would break out, it would be bad business for America. So yes, the war in Ukraine is to be understood in light of that. It's one of these wars that America needs to keep its economy going.
Bueno, Jack, muchas gracias por la generosidad con su tiempo y por compartir con nosotros argumentos tan convincentes sobre la guerra.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me. Bye-bye.